The moon hung high over the quiet Texas town of Pine Creek, a place where Sunday sermons carried weight, where people still left their doors unlocked, and where the pastor's word was as good as law. It was the kind of town where sin was hidden behind white picket fences and prayers were whispered through gritted teeth. But tonight, the town was about to witness something unholy, something that would stain its history forever. Pastor Daniel Whitmore had been the shepherd of Pine Creek's largest church for nearly 15 years. A man of God, a devoted husband, a respected figure. But beneath the surface, there was a tension in his home, one he never spoke of. His wife, Linda, had changed. She was distant, her kisses cold, her touch mechanical. And Daniel, for all his faith, was still a man with doubts, insecurities, and suspicions. That night, his worst fears were confirmed. He had just finished a late-night prayer session at the church when he decided to drive past Billy Carter's house. Billy wasn't just his best friend, he was his brother in Christ, a deacon at the church, and a man he trusted with his life. But trust was a fragile thing. As he approached, headlights flashed in the darkness. A car parked just off the main road, barely hidden between the oak trees. Daniel slowed down, his heart pounding in his chest. His gut told him something wasn't right. He knew that car. It was Linda's. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he pulled over and killed his lights. For a long moment, he just sat there, gripping the wheel, breathing heavily. Then he stepped out. As he approached, he could hear it, the soft sounds of movement, muffled moans, gasps. His stomach turned. He crept closer, his shoes sinking into the damp soil, and then he saw them. Through the windshield, lit by the dim glow of the car's dashboard, was Linda, kneeling, her head bobbing, Billy's hands tangled in her hair. Daniel's body went cold. He felt something snap inside him. He didn't remember how he got back to his truck. He didn't remember driving home. The next thing he knew, he was in his kitchen, his hands trembling, his mind blank. His Bible lay open on the counter. A passage stared back at him. For the lips of a strange woman drop as an honeycomb, and her mouth is smoother than oil, but her end is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Proverbs 5:3-4. His vision blurred, the words twisted in his mind, turning into something else, a command, a revelation. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, Pine Creek woke to horror. Sheriff Mike Grayson was sipping his morning coffee when the call came in. The 911 dispatcher's voice trembled. "Sheriff, we got a situation out on the Whitmore property." He arrived within 15 minutes. The Whitmore house was a modest white home with a wraparound porch, a place where Bible study groups gathered every Wednesday. But today, it was different. Crime scene tape had already been strung up. A deputy was outside, his face pale, his hands shaking. "Sheriff," he croaked, "it's bad." Mike stepped inside and nearly staggered back. The kitchen was a bloodbath. A woman's body lay slumped over the table, her neck a ragged mess where her head should have been. Blood had soaked into the wood, dripping onto the floor. A man sat across from her, still as a statue, Pastor Daniel Whitmore. His hands rested on an open Bible, now stained red. His face was eerily calm. Mike swallowed hard. "Pastor, what did you do?" Daniel finally looked up, his eyes empty. "I did what had to be done, Sheriff," he said, his voice as steady as his Sunday sermons. "I cleansed my home." Outside in the thick morning heat, the crime scene technicians worked in silence. Then one of them called out, "Sir, we found her head. It was in the backyard, buried in the soil, a clean cut, as if done with a single, deliberate stroke." Sheriff Mike exhaled sharply. This wasn't just murder. This was something else, something biblical, something dark. And Mike Grayson knew this was only the beginning. Sheriff Mike Grayson had seen his fair share of crime in Pine Creek. Bar fights, cattle theft, even the occasional domestic disturbance. But nothing like this. Nothing this brutal. The air inside the Whitmore house was thick with the metallic scent of blood. The crime scene techs worked quietly, taking pictures, collecting samples, murmuring in hushed tones. Linda Whitmore's headless body sat slumped over the kitchen table, the blood pooling beneath her, already beginning to dry. The Bible in front of Pastor Daniel was soaked in it, the pages curling, the ink smearing. And yet Daniel himself sat perfectly still, calm, resigned. Sheriff Mike pulled out a chair across from him and took a deep breath. "Pastor," he said, keeping his voice even, "I need you to tell me what happened here." Daniel blinked as if coming out of a trance. He looked at the sheriff like he was seeing him for the first time. "I did what had to be done," he repeated, his voice eerily steady. "She betrayed me. She defiled our home. The Lord commands justice." Mike clenched his jaw. "You saying you killed her?" Daniel nodded, slow and deliberate. "Yes, Sheriff." "I did." Mike studied him for a long moment. He had expected resistance, excuses, maybe even hysteria. But this was something else. The man had no fear, no remorse. He wasn't even trying to hide it. Mike rubbed his temples. "Where's the weapon?" Daniel pointed to the far counter, where a long, blood-streaked butcher knife lay beside the sink. "Jesus Christ," one of the deputies muttered under his breath. Mike turned to his team. "Bag it." Then looking back at Daniel, he asked, "Did you do it right here in the kitchen?" Daniel shook his head. "Number Etta started in the bedroom." Mike felt his stomach twist. "Go on." The pastor exhaled deeply. "She came home late. Thought I was asleep. But I was waiting. I confronted her, and she didn't even deny it. She laughed, Sheriff. Told me I wasn't man enough to satisfy her. That's when I knew she was lost, corrupted." Mike's fingers curled into a fist. "And then I told her she needed to repent. She refused. She spat in my face. That's when I knew there was no salvation for her. I grabbed the knife. She screamed. But I did it quickly. A single slice, just like Abraham preparing the sacrifice." Mike glanced toward the techs who were still collecting evidence. "So you decapitated her right there in the bedroom?" "Yes, then brought her body here?" "Yes." Mike ran a hand down his face. "And the head? Why bury it?" Daniel's lips curved into a small smile. "Because a whore's mouth brings ruin, Sheriff. The Lord said, 'If thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out.' Her mouth, it offended me." A chill ran down Mike's spine. This wasn't just a crime of passion. This was something darker, something unhinged, but something didn't add up. "Pastor," he said carefully, "how'd you know about Billy?" Daniel's expression hardened. "I saw them, last night, in the car." Mike raised an eyebrow. "What car?" Daniel hesitated. "Her car." "You sure about that?" A flicker of doubt crossed his face. Mike leaned forward. "We checked the driveway when we got here. Her car's right outside, Pastor. You saying she drove home after that?" Daniel's jaw clenched. No. He stopped, his fingers tightening on the bloodied Bible. Mike watched him closely. "You said you saw them. In her car. But if her car was here all night, then what car were they in?" Daniel swallowed. His grip on reality was slipping. "It was dark. I just knew it was her." Mike nodded slowly. "All right. And what about Billy? Did you go see him after?" Silence. Mike narrowed his eyes. "Pastor, where's Billy?" Daniel didn't answer. An hour later, the sheriff and his team pulled into Billy Carter's driveway. His truck was parked outside, untouched. No signs of movement, no answer at the door. "Break it down," Mike ordered. One hard kick, and the door swung open. The house was still. Too still. They found Billy in the living room, sitting in his recliner, with his throat slit from ear to ear. Blood soaked the chair, dripping onto the wooden floor. His eyes were still open, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. Deputy Riley cursed under his breath. "Son of a bitch." Mike exhaled. He turned to one of his men. "Call it in. We got ourselves a second crime scene." He already knew what this meant. Daniel hadn't told them everything, and the real story was far from over. Sheriff Mike Grayson stood in Billy Carter's living room, his boots sticking slightly to the blood-slicked floor. The air was thick with the stench of iron and something else. Fear. Billy's dead eyes stared at the ceiling, frozen in his last moment of horror. His throat had been slit so deep that his head was barely holding onto his shoulders. It was savage, precise. Mike took a deep breath. forcing himself to stay calm. Two bodies in one night, one by a man who claimed he was carrying out God's will. But Billy wasn't supposed to be dead. Mike turned to Deputy Riley, who was still staring at the body in disbelief. "This doesn't match, does it?" Riley shook his head. "Pastor confessed to killing his wife, said he saw her with Billy. But this ain't the same type of kill, Sheriff. Pastor went biblical on Linda. This looks more like an execution." Mike nodded. That was exactly what he was thinking. "Bag his phone," Mike said, pointing to the blood-stained device on the floor. "And get me a full sweep of this place. If Whitmore didn't do this, someone else did. And I want to know who." Back at the station, Daniel Whitmore sat in the interrogation room, still eerily calm. He had been given a clean jumpsuit, but traces of his wife's blood still clung to his hands, dried in the creases of his knuckles. Mike stepped inside, shutting the door behind him. He tossed a folder onto the table, the crime scene photos of Billy sliding out. He didn't say a word, just watched. Daniel's eyes dropped to the photos. His face didn't change. "You want to explain this to me?" Mike asked. "I told you," Daniel said evenly. "She betrayed me. She needed to be cleansed." "I ain't talking about Linda," Mike snapped. "Billy's dead. Throat cut. That don't look like cleansing to me, Pastor. That looks like revenge." Daniel blinked, but his silence was telling. "You didn't kill him, did you?" Mike pressed. Daniel licked his lips. "No," he admitted. "But I knew it would happen." Mike narrowed his eyes. "What the hell does that mean?" Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Sheriff, you don't understand. This was bigger than me. Bigger than her. There are things in Pine Creek, things moving in the shadows. The Lord revealed the truth to me, but I was blind for too long." Mike felt a headache creeping in. He had no patience for cryptic nonsense. "Pastor, you either tell me the truth right now, or I'm walking out of this room and leaving you to rot." Daniel exhaled slowly. "Billy wasn't just sleeping with my wife," he murmured. "He was into something worse, something evil. And when I found out, I wasn't the only one who wanted him gone." Mike's gut twisted. "Who else?" Daniel looked up, his eyes burning with something almost fanatical. "The people who run this town, Sheriff. The ones who sit in the front pews every Sunday, pretending to be righteous. The ones who know that sin must be punished." Mike felt an uneasy chill crawl up his spine. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know when someone was lying. But Daniel believed every damn word he was saying, and that scared him. Deputy Riley burst into the office just as Mike was leaving the interrogation room. "Sheriff, you need to see this." Mike followed him to the evidence lab where Billy Carter's phone had been cracked open. The tech guy, Sam, pointed to the screen. "Last text Billy received was at 10:47 p.m., same night Linda was killed." Mike read it. "Unknown number. You've been warned. Last chance to leave town." The text had gone unanswered. Mike looked up. "Can we trace the number?" Sam shook his head. "Burner phone. No registered owner." Mike cursed under his breath. Riley frowned. "Sheriff, if someone warned Billy to leave town, and then he winds up dead, that means we got another player in this." Mike nodded grimly. "And I need to find out who." That night, Mike drove to the one place he knew he'd find answers. The church. The doors were locked, but he had a key. Stepping inside, the air was cool, the scent of old wood and candle wax filling his nostrils. He walked slowly down the aisle, past the rows of pews until he reached the pulpit. Something wasn't right. The church always had a comforting presence, even during late-night patrols. But tonight it felt wrong. His eyes landed on the large wooden cross hanging above the altar. And then he saw it, a symbol, faintly scratched into the wood. Not a cross, not a religious marking. Something else, something ancient. Mike stepped closer, his heart pounding. And in that moment, he realized. This wasn't just about a jealous husband and a cheating wife. Something deeper was at play. Something that had been in Pine Creek long before Daniel Whitmore picked up that knife. The scratched symbol on the wooden cross sent a chill down Sheriff Mike Grayson's spine. It wasn't just a random carving. Someone had placed it there deliberately. It was old, precise, like a signature left behind for those who knew what to look for. Mike snapped a picture of it with his phone and sent it to Sam at the station. See if you can find out what the symbol means. Then a noise, a soft shuffle from the back of the church. Mike's hand went to his holster. Who's there? Silence. He moved cautiously down the aisle, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. The church was dimly lit by the streetlights outside, their glow casting long, eerie shadows. Then, movement. Just beyond the confession booth, Mike yanked his gun free and aimed. Step out, hands where I can see them. A figure emerged slowly, trembling. It was an older woman, Mrs. Ethel Wallace, the church secretary. She clutched her rosary tightly, her wrinkled hands shaking. Mrs. Wallace? Mike lowered his gun slightly. What are you doing here this late? She looked past him toward the cross, her eyes wide with fear. I was cleaning earlier. I saw someone carving that symbol. When I came back to check, I heard you. Mike studied her carefully. Who did you see? She hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone was listening. Then she whispered, Pastor Whitmore wasn't lying, Sheriff. There's something evil in Pine Creek. Been here longer than any of us. Mike exhaled, already tired of the cryptic warnings. Mrs. Wallace, I need facts. Who did you see carving the symbol? Her lips trembled. It was Deacon Bradley. Mike froze. Deacon Thomas Bradley? The same Thomas Bradley who had been on the church council for over 20 years. A respected businessman, a family man, and apparently a man who had just left his mark in blood. Back at the station, Sam was waiting for Mike in his office, looking uneasy. Sheriff, that symbol you sent me? It's an old one. Really old. Mike sat down, rubbing his temple. How old, like, ancient? It's tied to secret societies, cults, the kind that don't just worship God, but something else. Sam hesitated, then clicked on a document. Look at this. Mike leaned in, eyes scanning the page. It was an old newspaper article, decades old. Local church engulfed in scandal. 3 found dead in ritualistic killings. Below the headline was a grainy black and white photo. The symbol was carved into the victim's chest. Mike clenched his jaw. Where did this happen? Sam hesitated. Pine Creek, 1952. Mike felt his stomach drop. This town had secrets buried deeper than he ever imagined. It was nearly midnight when Mike pulled up to Thomas Bradley's house. The lights were still on, but the place was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Something felt off. Hand on his gun, Mike stepped onto the porch and knocked. Thomas, Sheriff Grayson, open up. No answer. He knocked again, harder. Still nothing. A bad feeling settled in his gut. He tried the door. Unlocked. He stepped inside. The house smelled of burnt wax and something else. Something metallic. Blood. His flashlight beam swept across the living room. The furniture was untouched, but there were dark stains on the hardwood floor. Symbols were drawn in what looked like dried blood. And then, a figure hanging from the ceiling fan. Mike's stomach twisted. It was Thomas Bradley, a noose around his neck. His body swayed slightly, casting eerie shadows against the wall. But that wasn't what made Mike's blood run cold. It was the carving on his forehead, the same symbol from the church, a warning. Whoever was behind this wasn't just covering their tracks. They were sending a message, and Sheriff Mike Grayson was next in line to receive it. Sheriff Mike Grayson stood beneath the swaying body of Deacon Thomas Bradley, his stomach tight with dread. The crime scene was cold, calculated. Whoever did this wanted to make a statement. Mike stepped closer, his flashlight illuminating the bloody carving on the deacon's forehead. The same symbol from the church, the same one from the decades-old newspaper article. This wasn't a murder, it was a ritual. Mike turned to Deputy Riley, who stood near the doorway, looking pale. Get the crime scene team out here. I want every inch of this place searched. Riley nodded and stepped away to radio for backup. Mike took another look around the room. On the coffee table, a Bible lay open, except the pages were defaced, black ink scribbled over the verses. Next to it, an old photograph, slightly yellowed with age. Mike picked it up. It was a group picture. 5 men standing outside Pine Creek Baptist Church. One of them was Deacon Thomas Bradley. Another was Pastor Daniel Whitmore. But it was the man in the center who made Mike's pulse quicken. A much younger Billy Carter. Mike's mind raced. How the hell were all 3 of them connected? Then he noticed something else. In the corner of the photograph, barely visible, was the same carved symbol. This wasn't new. This went back years. Back at the station, Mike sat across from Pastor Daniel Whitmore in the interrogation room. The pastor had been quiet since his arrest, but Mike had a feeling he knew more than he was letting on. Mike placed the photograph on the table. "You recognize this?" Daniel's eyes flicked down, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression. Fear. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "In Deacon Bradley's house, right before I found him hanging from his ceiling fan with this symbol carved into his forehead." Daniel swallowed hard. "It's happening again." Mike narrowed his eyes. "What is?" Daniel let out a slow, shaky breath. "You ever wonder why Billy Carter never left Pine Creek? Why a man like him, single, no family, no real job, always had money, influence?" Mike frowned. He had wondered that before. Billy never seemed to work much, yet he always had cash, always had a way of getting what he wanted. Daniel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Billy wasn't just sleeping with my wife, Sheriff. He was part of something. Something old, something dark." Mike leaned forward. The symbol, the one carved into the cross, into Bradley's forehead. "What does it mean?" Daniel hesitated, but then his face hardened. "It's a mark of loyalty, a covenant. The men in that picture, we were chosen, pulled into something we thought was about power, influence. We were young, stupid. We thought it was just a secret brotherhood, a way to control the town. But it was more than that." Mike felt his pulse quicken. "You're saying this was a cult?" Daniel nodded. "Billy was the first to truly embrace it. He made sacrifices, Sheriff. Real ones." Mike's blood ran cold. "What kind of sacrifices?" Daniel looked away. "The kind that demand blood." Mike needed answers. Fast. He left the station and drove straight to Billy Carter's house. If Billy had been at the center of this brotherhood, there had to be something in his home that proved it. The house was still an active crime scene, but Mike didn't care. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped inside. The living room was the same as before, blood-soaked, lifeless. But now Mike knew he was looking for something deeper. He moved to the study. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with dusty old religious texts, history books, and... Mike stopped. One of the books was slightly out of place. He pulled it. With a click, a small section of the bookshelf shifted, a hidden compartment. Inside was a leather-bound journal. Mike opened it. The pages were filled with handwritten entries, some in Billy's handwriting, some in others. But one entry, dated just 2 weeks ago, made Mike's stomach twist. "The time is near. The old ways must return. The blood must flow again, as it did before." Whitmore hesitates, but Bradley knows. The town must remember who truly holds the power. Mike clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about an affair. Billy Carter, Thomas Bradley, and Daniel Whitmore had been part of something far worse. And now someone was making sure their sins were paid in blood. Sheriff Mike Grayson sat in his car, gripping the leather-bound journal as his mind raced. Billy Carter's words confirmed it. This wasn't just about a jealous husband snapping. It was about something bigger, something that had existed in Pine Creek long before Daniel Whitmore's breakdown. The killings weren't random. They were planned. A reckoning. But by who? And who was next? Mike exhaled sharply, tucking the journal into his coat. He had one more stop before the night was over. If this so-called brotherhood ran the town from the shadows, there was only one man left who might have the full story. Mayor Richard Halstead. The mayor's house was a pristine 2-story home in the wealthiest part of Pine Creek, its white pillars glowing under the porch lights. But as Mike pulled up, an unsettling feeling settled in his gut. Something wasn't right. The front door was slightly open. Mike unholstered his gun and stepped inside. "Mayor Halstead." "Sheriff Grayson." "You home?" Silence. The house smelled like burnt candles and something deeper, something coppery. Blood. Mike's boots creaked on the hardwood floor as he moved through the foyer. The living room was untouched, the kitchen clean. But when he stepped into the mayor's office, his stomach twisted. Richard Halstead was seated in his chair, slumped forward over his desk. His throat had been cut, the wound clean and deliberate. Blood pooled beneath him, soaking the scattered papers on his desk. But what made Mike's blood run cold was the mark, carved into the mayor's forehead, just like Thomas Bradley, the same damn symbol. Mike took a step closer, his hands clenching. On the desk, near the mayor's outstretched fingers, lay an envelope, his name scrawled across the front. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words written in careful, deliberate handwriting. "You were never supposed to see this, but now you must understand. The blood oath cannot be broken. The cycle must continue. The town must obey." Mike swallowed hard. The town must obey. This wasn't over. By the time Mike returned to the station, the weight of the night sat heavy on his shoulders. 3 men were dead, all tied to a secret brotherhood that had controlled Pine Creek for decades, and someone was wiping them out. Mike walked straight to the interrogation room where Daniel Whitmore sat, staring blankly at the table. The pastor barely looked up as Mike entered, dropping the journal in front of him. "You want to tell me what the hell the blood oath is?" Mike demanded. Daniel exhaled slowly. "You found Billy's journal." "Yeah, and I also found Mayor Halstead with his throat cut open. Same mark carved into his forehead. That means 3 of you are dead. You're the only one left standing. So talk." Daniel leaned back, closing his eyes. "It started before us, Sheriff. Before I was ever a preacher. Before I even knew what I was part of. The Brotherhood controlled Pine Creek. They made the rules, decided who thrived, who suffered. We weren't the first to wear that mark, just the latest to bear the weight of it." Mike frowned. "You're telling me this town has been run by a secret society for years?" Daniel gave a hollow chuckle. "Call it what you want. A cult, a cabal, a good old boys club. But yes, it was real. Billy, Bradley, Halstead, and me. We were all chosen. We were promised power, influence. But there was a cost." Mike's hands tightened into fists. "And what was that cost?" Daniel finally met his eyes. "A sacrifice." Mike's blood went cold. Daniel continued. "Every 25 years there had to be blood. Someone had to die. It was the price for keeping Pine Creek prosperous, wealthy, safe." His voice trembled. "The others before us did it, and we were supposed to, too. But I refused. I told them it was wrong. I thought I could break the cycle." Mike clenched his jaw. "But Billy didn't agree, did he?" Daniel shook his head. "Billy was committed to the oath. He wanted me to help choose the next sacrifice. He said it was our turn to make the offering, but I wouldn't do it." His voice broke. "That's why he went after Linda, to punish me, to force my hand." Mike inhaled sharply. Billy had been carrying out his own twisted justice, but someone else had decided he needed to die, and now the rest of the Brotherhood was being erased. "Who else knew?" Mike pressed. "Who else is part of this?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know, but whoever's doing this, they're finishing what I was too weak to end." Mike didn't sleep that night. Sitting in his office, he stared at the crime scene photos. Billy Carter, Thomas Bradley, Mayor Halstead, all dead, and Daniel Whitmore still alive. Mike tapped his fingers against his desk. Someone was picking off the old members of the Brotherhood, making sure the cycle was broken for good. But who? His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You're looking in the wrong place. Whitmore is not the last." Mike's pulse quickened. There was still another target, another name on the list. And if he didn't figure out who it was soon, they'd be the next body found with that symbol carved into their skin. The sun was beginning to rise over Pine Creek, casting long shadows across the empty streets. But for Sheriff Mike Grayson, there was no rest. Not while there was still one more death to prevent. The message on his phone was clear. Whitmore is not the last. Someone else was involved. Someone Mike hadn't yet considered. Someone who was pulling the strings behind the scenes. And Mike's instinct told him that the answer lay at the heart of Pine Creek, the church. Mike arrived at Pine Creek Baptist Church just as the early morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored patterns on the floor. It looked peaceful, almost serene, but Mike knew better. He was walking into the belly of the beast. Inside, everything was quiet. The usual hum of parishioners preparing for the early service was absent. Mike moved toward the back of the church, where the pastor's office stood. He pushed the door open, and there, standing in the center of the room, was Pastor Daniel Whitmore. But he wasn't alone. Two other figures were in the room with him. One was a tall, thin man Mike recognized as Deacon Harold Brooks, another longtime member of the church council. The other, however, was a stranger, an older man, thin and gaunt, wearing a dark suit. His face was pale, his eyes cold and calculating. Mike froze, his hand instinctively going to his holster. The man in the suit spoke first, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "Sheriff Grayson, I've been expecting you." Mike didn't take his eyes off him. "Who the hell are you?" The man smiled faintly. "Names don't matter, Sheriff. What matters is the bloodline, the cycle." Mike's mind clicked into place. This man wasn't just another church member. He was the one pulling the strings, the one who had orchestrated everything. "You're the one behind all this," Mike said, his voice steady but full of accusation. "You've been orchestrating these killings to keep the blood oath alive." The man chuckled darkly. "Not orchestrating, Sheriff, just guiding. You see, there is power in blood, power in the sacrifices that must be made. The brotherhood you've been hunting is just a small part of something much older, much larger than you can imagine. It was never just about Pine Creek. It was about legacy." Deacon Brooks stepped forward, his face tense. "You need to leave, Sheriff. This is bigger than you." Mike ignored him, his eyes fixed on the man in the suit. "Who are you?" The man smiled again. "I am the keeper of the bloodline. I have watched over this town, its rituals, its power for years. The Brotherhood was my creation, a way to ensure the town thrived under my watch. But it wasn't enough. I needed more." Mike felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "You've been using them, using everyone." The man nodded slowly. "Indeed, the town has prospered because of the blood we've spilled, the sacrifices we've made. But now the time has come for the final offering." Mike's heart began to race. "What do you mean, the final offering?" The man's smile faded. "The last sacrifice must come from the highest of them all, the one who has held the most power, the one who has led the town for decades." He pointed toward Daniel Whitmore, the preacher. Daniel's face went pale as the man spoke. He opened his mouth to protest, but the man silenced him with a sharp look. "You've been part of this, Pastor Whitmore," the man continued, "but your time is over. It's time for you to give your blood for the cycle to complete." Mike took a step forward, his voice full of fury. "You're not going to get away with this." The man turned to Deacon Brooks, giving him a silent command. Without a word, Brooks lunged at Mike, but Mike was ready. He ducked under the attack, drawing his gun and aiming it at Brooks. "Stop!" Mike yelled, his finger on the trigger. "You're not getting away with it." Brooks froze, his eyes darting between Mike and the man in the suit. The tension in the room thickened, as if the very air itself was charged with the weight of the moment. The man in the suit sighed. "You don't understand, Sheriff. This is inevitable. The blood must flow. The Brotherhood must remain intact." Mike's hand trembled, but he kept his aim steady. "Not if I have anything to say about it." In that moment, everything clicked. The murders weren't just about keeping a secret. The man in the suit was part of a larger, far-reaching conspiracy. Pine Creek's prosperity wasn't just about wealth. It was about the power that came from control. Control over life, death, and sacrifice. Mike had been right all along. The man in the suit wasn't just a preacher. He was the true leader, the one who had manipulated the entire town, using the cycle of death to ensure his position. But it was time for it to end. "I'm arresting you," Mike said firmly, his voice steady. "All of you." The man in the suit sneered. "You can't stop it. The blood has been spilled. The legacy cannot be undone." Mike's eyes hardened. "We'll see about that." With one swift motion, he handcuffed Deacon Brooks, then turned to the man in the suit. As he did, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. Daniel Whitmore, his face filled with desperation. The preacher lunged for the man in the suit, knocking him off balance. In that moment, Mike made his move. He tackled the man to the ground, his gun drawn and aimed at his head. "You're done," Mike said coldly. "It ends here." The man's cold, calculating gaze locked onto Mike. "You don't understand," he whispered. "This is just the beginning. The bloodline is eternal." Mike pulled the trigger, ending it all. The town of Pine Creek had been held captive by fear and manipulation for far too long. But with the death of the man in the suit, the cycle was broken. It was over. Pine Creek was free.